Welcome back to ISSR's In Conversation series. My name is Anthony King-Nairn, Executive Assistant of the International Society of Science and Religion, ISSR. If you're joining us for the first time, ISSR In Conversation is a discussion series where ISSR Fellows discuss topics on and related to their work and the happenings in the academic field of science and religion. If you enjoy this content and want to see or hear more of it, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us keep content like this coming. And this is also available on most major podcast services, so do consider subscribing to the podcast if you enjoy listening while on the go. This episode is both a special one and a sad one. On February 27th, 2023, ISSR Fellow Tom McLeish died after a short battle with serious illness. Tom was a major figure in the field of science and religion, having published two major contributions to the field, one called Faith and Wisdom in Science from 2014, and the other, The Poetry and Music of Science from 2019, both of which I recommend reading. He also published many papers and made contributions across a range of academic and professional outputs. Tom began his career as a physicist, specifically a soft matter physicist. He even wrote the very short introduction series by Oxford University Press if you're interested in learning more. He was a major figure in that field and was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 2011 as a result. But he was also a well-respected scholar of the humanities and theology, participating in and leading humanities research groups throughout his career. Myself, I find his strength and wide interests best reflected by his last title held, Chair of Natural Philosophy, a position he held at the University of York from 2018 until his death. I had the privilege of speaking with Tom a number of times in 2019, as Tom was the 2019 ISSR Boyle Lecture on Science and Religion, a prestigious annual lecture series that ISSR runs in collaboration with the Boyle family and St. Mary Le Bow Church in London. Due to COVID-19, the lecture was moved entirely online, but Tom did not let that get in his way. With his help, his lecture became one of the best regarded and was the first to be entirely online. It also became our most viewed video on YouTube, and we now maintain an online recording of subsequent lectures as a result. If you have not yet watched the 2021 Boyle Lecture, I highly recommend it. And afterward, you could also watch the first post-lecture discussion, where other scholars asked Tom questions about his lecture. This was a first for the Boyle Lectures, and something we have kept going ever since. Links to both will be in the description box below. While Tom was ill, he would write to me often and keep me up to date on all things he found interesting relating to the field of science and religion. I remember his sharp and strong will, and he was always kind, polite, and eager to listen. This episode, then, is a celebration of Tom, a reflection of his memory and work. You will hear presentations from highly respected people in the field of science and religion from a range of disciplines, all of whom knew Tom both professionally and personally. In conversation are ISSR Executive Secretary Fraser Watts, Professor Christopher Southgate, Professor Wilson Poon, Professor Mark Harris, and Dr. Joanna Leidenhag. Links for each speaker will be in the description box as well. It should become obvious while listening just what impact Tom had on everyone who knew him and the field of science and religion. Please enjoy this episode of ISSR In Conversation on Tom McLeish.
So it's a pleasure to welcome you to this ISSR session to honor Tom McLeish. Brilliant, distinguished, creative, a huge loss to the science and religion community. A very distinguished scientist and fellow of the Royal Society, and making a really major contribution to science and religion, particularly with the two books, Faith and Wisdom in Science, and The Poetry and Music of Science. His Boyle Lecture was probably one of the best Boyle lectures there's ever been, I think, and given under the difficult conditions of COVID, a challenge that he rose to magnificently. So I think all of us here are very inspired by what Tom has done, and very aware of the extent of our loss. And we want just in a modest way to take stock of his huge contribution and to honor him and to continue to learn from him. And we have 4 speakers here who are going to speak in turn, and we'll have a short period of discussion after each of them. Wilson Poon, Mark Harris, Joanna Leidenhag, and Christopher Southgate. And I noticed as I was preparing for this session that we moved gradually north to south in our speakers. I hadn't planned it, but that's the way it starts. We start in Scotland with our first 2 speakers from Edinburgh. Professor Wilson Poon first, Professor of Natural Philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. Thank you for being with us, Wilson. Over to you.
Thank you. Let me make the technology work. Yes. Right. Okay, so I was asked to speak just for a few minutes on Tom McLeish, the scientist. So I probably, in this gathering, I probably knew Tom for long enough, so I thought I'd show you a photograph of young Tom McLeish from 83, 84. That was him on the way with me to the Cavendish laboratory. In fact, I seem to remember that he wanted to come and see my my laboratory experiment that I was doing as a final year project. So even as a theorist, he was very interested in people doing experiments. So Tom and I went back to our Cambridge degree. We were born in the same year. We were studying physics in Cambridge together. So I guess one way to talk about his science really is to show you the little book that he wrote, much thinner than either of his theology books. This is his Oxford short soft matter, very short introduction. And soft matter is a relatively new area of science. Let me show you what Google Ngram shows the use of the 2 gram. This 2-letter phrase, soft matter, is basically not used until about the early 90s. And the significant thing here is that Tom started his PhD in 1984. We started our PhDs together. So basically, Tom belonged to the first generation of scientists who self-consciously was starting a new field, which is now come to be known as soft matter. And I'll explain to you what that means in a moment. But you may not know that Tom actually originally wanted to do his PhD in astrophysics. But the way he tells the story was he was rescued by Sir Sam Edwards just in time. He said the day before he actually signed up for an astrophysics PhD, Sam Edwards, who was the Cavendish professor of physics at that point, basically said to Tom, why do you want to do astrophysics? Polymers is far more interesting. So the way Tom put it is, phew, I was rescued just in time the day before I was going to spend my time doing astrophysics. Instead, Sam persuaded him to do polymers instead. So here's a picture of someone stretching some polymers. And polymers, of course, is what Tom and I would call goo. So Tom basically belonged to the first generation of scientists who self-consciously made a new field of physics, which I would call goo physics. And in fact, throughout Tom's scientific career, he spoke of Sir Sam warmer than he would speak for anybody else. And I think if he had to pick out one mentor, he would have picked out Sam. If there's time at the end, I would tell you a great story about Sam and Tom. You have to prompt me, but it's not part of my talk. So what is goo? Well, I think Tom would agree with me that one of the most classic pots of goo you can buy is a pot of paint. So if you look inside a pot of paint, it has 3 different kinds of bits in it. There were some solid particles, which constitute the pigment. So the red paint would have red bits of particles in it. There are some long chain line molecules, which typically coil up into a ball form. These are the bits that actually merge together eventually to form the protective film that gives you the sheen on the paint and to protect. But the trouble about these molecules are typically they're not water soluble. So if you want a water-based paint, what you need to do is solubilize them. So what you do is you use these surfactants or soap-like molecules to solubilize these polymers. So in the pot of paint, these bits of polymers, which are the plastics, are typically encapsulated by a protective ring of soap-like molecules. When you wash up, it's the oil that encapsulated and the soap-like molecule carry away the dirt. So basically, goo, one definition is that they are all liquids with bits in it. So this is a liquid, but it has bits in it, solid pigments, polymer molecules, or these superstructures made by surfactant molecules. So these bits are all kind of between 50 nanometers and about 5 microns. So this is just below 5 microns. It's just below what you can resolve the human eye. So goo science is the science of liquids with bits in it. And Tom's own specialty really is in polymers. So these are these long chain molecules. So of course, polymer physics has existed for a long time, but around about the mid-80s, polymer physics became merged with the study of colloidal particles and surfactant aggregates to form a completely new science called soft matter physics. And Tom was one of the pioneers of that new science. So his own specialty in this new science is called rheology. So this is a quote from Heraclitus. No one knew whether he actually said it to Pantare. This was a quotation of Heraclitus from someone else, but this means everything flows. The next sentence says everything and nothing stays constant. But rheology is the study of flow and deformation, particularly of gooey liquids. So this Greek quotation even occurs in the logo of the Society of Rheology, which is the international association based in America for rheologists. And Tom's standing in the community is shown by the recognition that I'm going to show you a picture of the medal he got in a moment. He got a gold medal from the Society of Rheology. So in order to understand Tom's contribution, I need to explain to you Edwards and Degen's tube model of reptation. Edwards here is Sam Edwards. Degen is P.G. Degen. He was awarded the 1991 Nobel Prize. Everybody thought it should have been given to Edwards and Degen together, but I don't know why Sam Edwards didn't get it, but never mind. So the tube model of reptation comes from the appreciation of how snakes would move through an undergrowth. So if you think of a long chain molecule like a polymer in a melt, so a melt is lots of polymer chains. Think of a dish of spaghetti. Suppose I pick out one of these pieces of spaghetti in red. So what you realize is that this chain, this red chain, its motion is constrained by many thousands of other chains. So it can't move any way it likes. So for example, you want to come up through the page, it can't, because in order to come up through the page, it has to break either this chain or break itself, right? So that's breaking of a covalent bond. Those chemical bonds are very strong, so it's just not going to happen under everyday stresses you can put in stirring a pot of polymer. So the movement of this particular polymer chain is constrained by thousands of its neighbors. Now, what Edwards and Degen realized was that what you can do is to just coarse grain the effect of all the gray chains as a tube. So the way you can think of the motion of the red chain is that its motion at any one moment of time is constrained by a tube. And this tube is basically formed by all these other chains. Okay, so this is the key concept. So at any one moment, this polymer is not free to go anywhere. It can only wiggle along this tube. So this is a little bit like a snake moving through a whole bunch of twigs in the undergrowth of a forest. So hence the word reptation. So a snake reptates. Okay, so what happens is that as the chain wiggles along, this piece of chain has wriggled out of the original tube at one particular time. So this is the tube at time 0. So given a little bit of time, the chain wiggles up and down. So at some point, a little bit of it would have wiggled out. And so this part of the tube vanishes. So in other words, it's no longer feeling these constraints. So given enough time, the chain wiggles out of either ends, eventually would have wiggled out of the whole tube. Okay. So after a certain amount of time from this moment, the whole chain now is as good as free, is effectively free because none of the original constraints exist anymore. And that defines a characteristic time scale, tau naught, which increases alarmingly fast into some power, which is close to free, with the number of beats that makes up this chain. The longer the chain is, the longer it will take to wiggle out of this tube. So below this time scale, however many seconds this is, the tube behaves as if it is not completely free to go anywhere it likes. But beyond this time scale, the tube behaves as if there is no time constraints to its movement. Now that's fairly abstract, but basically I'm telling you this because Tom became one of the consummate both exponents and developers of a tube model. He basically applied these insights of Edwards and Degen to industrially useful materials to make actual usable numerical predictions. So I'm going to get no more complicated than this, and this is the only equation I'm going to show. And to show his achievement, he was awarded the 2010 Bingham Medal by the Society of Biology. This is, you can consider this the highest award in a subject in the world. So that's how high a regard he was held in. So everything that you need to know about polymers is shown by this demonstration of silly putty. I'm going to stop this. So can you still hear me? I think you can still hear me. So let me play this video again. No, sorry. At short time scales, when you pull it slowly, below this tau naught time scale, it just deforms. The polymer chains behave as if it has no constraints. But you want to try to deform it at a fast time scale, such as the time scale of the bounce, then it behaves as if the chains are constrained. If you're constrained, you can't move anywhere, then you behave like a solid. So at short time scale, the time scale of the bounce, the chains all behave as if they are constrained, they can't get anywhere, they behave like a solid. At long time scale, when you deform it slowly, the thing can move. So Tom became an expert in applying this chain model. Now, what has this got to do with theology? Let me make you a comment. The point is, this process is called coarse graining. There is no actual tube here. The tube is a fiction, is a figment of the theorist's imagination, but it represents very well the constraints that are imposed on this chain by these all these other chains. So this is called coarse graining, and so there exists a legitimate and very fruitful level of theorizing that neglects microscopic details, and that I think give Tom throughout his life a healthy skepticism of any totalizing theory of everything on microscopic constituents. And I think you can recognize some of his theological motivation from here. So he also applied coarse graining to biophysics. In the latter part of his scientific career, he did very a lot of biology. In fact, he completely overturned the lock and key model of enzyme action. The traditional model of enzyme action says an enzyme is like a lock, totally rigid. The substrates for the enzyme is like a key, totally rigid. The substrate fits into a rigid keyhole, and the enzyme does something to it. And what he showed is that enzymes actually need to wobble. So he coarse grained this very complicated enzyme into just 2 boards connected by 5 springs. And that coarse graining model shows you that this enzyme can only work if all the bits actually wobble. And that means that the lock cannot be rigid and the substrate cannot be rigid. And so that is another example of Tom's coarse graining. And some of his most interesting contribution concerns topology. So, this is a linear chain polymer, but you can make all kinds of other polymers. This is a coarse grain picture, but you can see that the connectivities are different. And Tom spent a lot of time and got very famous thinking about these dumbbell polymers. So this dumbbell is a multi-arm branch polymer. And you can see that for this multi-arm branch polymer to wiggle out of this chain, these arms cannot individually wiggle out. They have to collectively wiggle out. And so this becomes a bottleneck. This becomes a bottleneck. And Tom becomes very famous after this paper, which gave a tube model for the simplest multi-branch polymer. Now, the reason for telling you this is twofold. One is that one of his best papers, I think, where he talks about topological order that comes out of topology as one of the most important emergent properties. That the topology of a chain cannot be reduced to the individual constituents. So that comes directly from his scientific work. Secondly, let me take you to this verse in Genesis. So, one of the ways that the Hebrew scriptures talk about humanity's role in creation is that it worked with the creator in naming. Well, so Tom was drawing this picture together with Ron Larson. And at some point, they looked at each other and said, well, what do we call polymers like this, especially in this configuration? What do you think they called it? I mean, I wasn't there, but I can hear the way Tom laughs when they come up with this name. I mean, only Tom and Ron Larson, who is another very famous physicist, who is also a devout Christian believer from Michigan, they came up with this name. And whenever I talk to Tom about science, whenever anybody talks to Tom about science, you get the feeling from him that science is hilarious fun. So I think his work on the pom-pom polymers not only illustrates his deep thinking about coarse graining, about topology, about emergence, but also reflects the fact that he thinks science is great fun. And I think that is absolutely crucial. I mean, this is Tom, by the way, this is a young Tom in the 80s in a Cambridge College Christian Union annual house party being encased in a tube. I don't know how he feels about me showing you this picture, but I think this is my picture of Tom having great fun. But okay, okay. I mean, let me take you a little bit to Proverbs 8:30. I was beside him, this is wisdom speaking, like a little child when the Lord created everything. When I was daily his delight, playing before him always. Tom didn't say this in his book on wisdom and science, but I'm absolutely certain, because I talked to him about it, that he agrees with me that if we're going to recover what it means to use this bounty of knowledge wisely to the benefit rather than the destruction of humanity, rediscovering the playfulness of science is absolutely crucial. And I think Tom's entire scientific life is a recovery of the playful delight of wisdom at the beginning of creation. Now, of course, you know, because Tom says so in the book, he wrote this book in order to construct a theology of science. So let me end by giving you a little bit of history of how that enterprise began. It begins with this book. Tom and I has a nasty habit when we go and stay with each other to put one book next to the bedside of our guest to see whether we can keep our guest awake all night because he has to finish the book. I think I won this contest because this book, which I put next to Tom's bedside cabinet when he stayed with me, kept him awake all night. He read it all night, and he alternately laughed and cried. And that led to us writing this paper. This was Tom's first publication in Science and Theology. It's my first two. We responded to Steiner's real presences because it really literally made us both laugh and cry together. And in this paper, this is how we ended. Let me just read this out to you and I finish. Strangely, the distant key of Steiner's coda is precisely the key in which we have struggling to articulate a theology of science. This is where we both began, understanding that what is needed is to articulate a theology of science. Our minds, the shape of a Christian understanding of the scientific enterprise, does have that same outline of Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And what we mean by that is a biblical theology, and Tom understands, and his books show that his theology of science is a biblically based one, of our meeting with the material world to say that science is a work of Saturday. What we mean by a work of Saturday is that it is a mixture of hope and pain. And so also the shock of relevance, when we follow Steiner on his journey and find it at the close of real presences, it tells us that art, poetry, and music share with science the same mixture of hope and pain. Here lies his second book about poetry. But the reason why I want to bring that up is that sounds like a good coda for us to say in memoriam of our friend Tom in pain and hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wilson. Thank you for that, conveying the importance and the excitement of Tom's scientific work. We can pause for a moment if anyone has questions or comments. Thank you very much for that contribution. In which case, let's go on to Mark Harris, Professor Mark Harris, Professor of Natural Science and Theology, also at Edinburgh, and currently President of ESSAT. Mark.
Thank you, Fraser. And thank you also, Wilson, for that really lovely introduction to Tom and his identity as a scientist theologian towards the end, which is what I was asked to talk about as well. So I'm going to say, I'll try not to say the same things as you, Wilson, but I'm sure there will be some overlap. Now, hopefully you can all see my slides by now. Is that right? Could someone give me a thumbs up or something?
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So I'm going to split my talk into three. First, Tom as a scientist theologian, then Tom as a natural philosopher. And I should note that Wilson is also a natural philosopher as well as his title. And then I'll say a bit more about the Faith and Wisdom in Science book, because I think this is really Tom's magnum opus as a scientist theologian. Well, this title, scientist theologian, I've become rather fascinated with this category of being, species, if you like, of academic over the last few years. And I've been collecting various quotations about what other people say about us, because I get labeled with this title, and I know Tom has been labeled with it, various others have been. And he and I, when we saw each other and spoke about this, we would inevitably talk about John Polkinghorne, who of course died very recently as well. And we had an ISSR session about him just, it was about 6 or 7 months ago, I think. And I ended up reflecting on some of the same themes. What does it mean to be a scientist theologian? What does it mean to be branded as a scientist theologian? And Tom and I used to talk about this, and particularly because we both came from the stable of physics. Tom also wrote a nice little paper about Polkinghorne as a scientist theologian, and he couldn't resist the temptation to bring the book of Job in there, which I thought was an interesting thing, because I don't remember Polkinghorne saying much about Job, but nevertheless, Tom did this. And so what I've done in my slides is to think a little bit about this scientist theologian category and how well does it apply to Tom. So when we think about the scientist theologian, various names come to mind, such as Ian Barber, Arthur Peacock, and of course, John Polkinghorne, who I found a nice little paper about John in particular, which explored this category. And I think we can probably apply this to Tom as well, with some qualifications. I don't think we would call him one of the first generation scientist theologians like Polkinghorne and Peacock. He would certainly be one of the new generation, I think. And like I said, he wrote a very touching appreciation of Polkinghorne in 2021, exploring this title. Now, significant to the title of scientist theologian is this category of bottom-up thinking. And in fact, Tom discusses this in his paper about Polkinghorne. So I'll just read this quotation that Polkinghorne himself, this is how he describes himself as a bottom-up thinker, or I suppose we might say a scientist theologian. And John wrote, "It is by seeking to start with the phenomena that give rise to the theories that I characterize myself as a bottom-up thinker. It's a natural stance for a scientist to adopt," says Polkinghorne. "We've learned so often in our exploration of the physical world that evident general principles are often neither so evident nor so general as one might at first have supposed. Many theologians are instinctively top-down thinkers," he said. "I don't deny a role for such ambitious intellectual effort. I'm merely wary of it and wish to temper its grand generality with the questionings that arise from the consideration of particularity." So for Polkinghorne, he had this sort of binary, if you like, between the kind of bottom-up approach of the scientist and the top-down approach of the theologian. Now, what would a scientist theologian be? Would they be a bottom-up person or a top-down person? I really don't know, to be honest. Did Tom think in a bottom-up way or a top-down way? It's not really clear to me, although certainly scouring through his Faith and Wisdom book, I detect a much more of a kind of a bottom-up than a top-down way, but I'd be interested to hear what others have to say on that, particularly Wilson. But I'm not sure that this is so really a useful category for thinking through Tom as a scientist theologian anyway. And I'd rather use something else I've discovered down the years in thinking through this job description of scientist theologian, which comes from Philip Hefner. And he, again, was talking about John Polkinghorne. And I'll just read this quotation through. So this is Philip Hefner speaking about John Polkinghorne. "Without wishing for a moment to denigrate the brilliant intellectual substance of Polkinghorne's work or his intention to advance towards a cogent statement of truth, I'd characterize his work and that of other scientist theologians as a form of confession. This witness is especially significant since our culture possesses no publicly acknowledged alternative to the warfare hypothesis. I think we miss Polkinghorne's cultural significance and intellectual theological impact if we don't see that his confession is more important than, say," and then Hefner goes on to talk about some of Polkinghorne's famous theories in science and religion. So for Hefner, who of course, speaking as a theologian, he sees Polkinghorne's main contribution in terms of confession. Now, would that be valid for thinking about Tom as a scientist theologian? Perhaps more so, I think. And I certainly value and the many talks I saw him give, the books and papers I read of his in the science theology world, particularly the work he did in making science so much more accessible to people, talking about the mystery and of course the wisdom that science brings. And this is perhaps a way into the scientist theologian category that I personally find a little bit more accessible than talking about bottom up, top down, and so on. This idea of confession. Other issues that we might want to consider in thinking through Tom as a scientist, theologian. Critical realism is something that I'm often asked about. Am I a critical realist? And I never know how to answer this. I'm not sure Tom would have known. Well, I'm sure he would have had a good answer. I wouldn't describe him as a critical realist, though, in the way that the first generation of scientist theologians, such as Polkinghorne and Peacock, they were so closely associated with this. I wouldn't describe Tom as a critical realism. I think he was much more concerned with the search for wisdom rather than any discussion of what was real or anti-real. And here are some great quotations from his Faith and Wisdom in Science book. I mean, the book is full of good quotations, really, about science. So I just collected a few here. He said, "Good science is arguably about being false in a constructive way that takes us nearer the truth rather than capturing truth in some timeless way." I don't think a critical realist would put it like that, but I can see exactly what Tom is saying, and I think he's absolutely right that this is true to good science. It's about being false in a constructive way. Another quotation from near the beginning of the book: "Although science has delivered the knowledge to solve these problems," and Tom has just been talking about various problems like climate catastrophe, for instance, and poverty, he says that science, the wisdom to use science, doesn't seem to come with the package. And so in many ways, this book is an attempt to start to talk about the ways in which science might gain, or scientists, or we might gain some wisdom in order to use science. I think Tom was much more concerned with wisdom, the search for wisdom, than he was with the real. And this is why I think critical realism probably wasn't a central concern for him. And so this is why I think that actually it's more appropriate to speak of Tom as a natural philosopher than a scientist theologian, although of course he worked in theology. But his last job title was Professor of Natural Philosophy. And I think it was absolutely the right one for him, because he had an absolute love of wisdom. Here's another great quotation from Faith and Wisdom in Science. Tom says, "We know better than to swallow an inadequate narrative that portrays science as simply replacing an ancient world of myth and superstition with a modern one of fact and comprehension." So he's talking to the conflict hypothesis here. "Science, as we framed it within a broader and older love of wisdom of natural things, does indeed call on a growing illumination of nature by experiment and imagination. But science also emerges from an ancient longing and from an older narrative of our complex relationship with the natural world. Its primary energy is imagination rather than fact. Its primary experience is more typically trial than triumph." And this is another great quotation, because it manages to capture quite a lot of what Tom is doing in the book by looking at really quite ancient texts, like the Book of Job, for instance, and some ancient thinkers. So as you'll probably be well aware, one of the things that Tom is well known for is his interest in medieval philosophy and the work he did on the 13th century Bishop Robert Grosseteste. And in the book, Tom uses Grosseteste as an example of someone in his own search for wisdom, thinks about cosmologies of his day, particularly Aristotelian thought, theological moves, and makes a really amazing move towards a modern sort of relativistic understanding of light, which is quite astonishing, really. And this, we have Tom to thank for pointing us towards the ways that some of the medieval thinkers made astonishingly contemporary kind of moves in their thought about the natural world. Now, in the book, those of you who've read it will be aware that Tom is not just talking about science at all. It's really a book about the humanities as well, and other kinds of sciences than just the natural sciences. He includes the social sciences in there, literature, music, history, and of course, theology. Now, theology comes in for the greatest attention in the book, including the natural sciences, particularly in Tom's extended treatment of how to build a theology of science. And Tom's point is that a theology of science is not just about, like telling us more about the doctrine of creation, but it will tell us all about the natural sciences in the context of this human search for wisdom, and particularly this human search for wisdom in the face of suffering and the fact that we don't understand the world. There is much about the world that we don't like, that we don't understand, that we find hard to reconcile. So the book ends up talking about this ministry of reconciliation, of which science and his thinking about the book of Job is central. Now, those of you who've read Tom's book will realize that it's a pretty complex and wide-ranging book. It doesn't really have a clear overarching thesis, I think. The way Tom writes it is more a sort of gradual unfolding of purpose and conviction. So it's quite difficult to categorize this book, although it's clearly inevitably going to fall into the genre of science and religion, because there is so much science and so much religion in it. But even then, it defies that kind of categorization, because one of the things that I was really delighted by when I came across this is how well Tom kind of destroys a lot of the old thinking, or say old, the previous generation's thinking, if you like, about the way that science and religion should relate to each other, relationship, typologies like conflict, independence. To Tom, these were all part of the problem of science and religion. They were just creating the problem they were designed to solve. And in fact, even talking about science and religion, the problem there is that we need to relate them with this word "and." Problem isn't science, it isn't religion, it's the "and." Better to replace the "and" with a whole new phrase, theology of science, because then he says that, I think I need to go into my next quotation here. So if we do that, talk about a theology of science rather than science and religion, we find that science belongs within the larger theological narrative of creation, pain, and healing. And this is what Tom does through looking at the book of Job, which is central to the book, starts to talk about creation, pain, and healing, and science's role in that. And what Tom does, it's interesting. Tom has become so closely associated with the book of Job, but when you look at how many pages he devotes to Job in the book, it's actually relatively slim, that section. Nevertheless, he goes through the book in quite a lot of detail. He engages with a lot of scholarship and shows that he has really done his work on this book, and provides a very inventive and original reading, which particularly is focused on the natural world in Job. And what he does, he describes how scientists are inevitably drawn to God's questions for Job in chapters 38 to 41. Another nice little quotation here from page 102. And this is where he's setting the scene. Job's search for wisdom, Tom says, strikes a chord with the modern scientist. And Tom says, science also emerges from an ancient longing and from an older narrative of our complex relationship with the natural world. Its primary creative grammar is the question rather than the answer. And of course, those of you who know the book of Job will know that it's full of questions. And in fact, that the crowning point when God replies to Job, God's reply is a whole load of questions. Tom's point, of course, is that for science, the primary creative grammar is the question rather than the answer. And he goes on to say, its primary energy, that science is imagination rather than fact. Its primary experience is more typically trial than triumph, as I mentioned before. So Tom's naturalistic reading of Job, I think, is really, really very innovative. It is arguably rather selective, though. And I have to say that from my training as a biblical scholar, when I read Tom on Job, I wish that he would say, he has said a lot more about Job. There's so much that can be said. But as it is, his reading is really very effective, particularly because he's not trying to write to biblical scholars in that kind of way as another academic work, but trying to set up this theology of science. Like modern science, Tom explains how Job's view of nature is restless and searching, but unlike modern science, Job's view of nature recognizes a wider context where reconciliation between humans, nature, and God is a very urgent desire. So this allows Tom to draw the point about science that I mentioned before, the need to focus on the values. And then we get this nice statement in a couple of chapters after the Job chapter, when Tom is talking about the urgency to develop a theology of science. He says, science becomes, within a Christian theology, the grounded outworking of the ministry of reconciliation between humankind and the world. This phrase, ministry of reconciliation, I remember when I first read this, I thought, what, Tom, what are you doing here? This is a phrase from 2 Corinthians. The Apostle Paul is using this to speak of his Christian ministry to the Gentiles, ministry of reconciliation. But how is this relevant to what scientists do? But it's a very striking instance of the way that Tom develops his thought across biblical texts, particularly Job, but also Paul, in the way that the sciences are doing much more than just learning things about the way the natural world works, but also have a role to play in the way that humans actually operate in the world and the way that we should be reconciled to the world. And I should really start to finish up by about now. So I've really just scratched the surface of this book and of Tom's career. I mean, he really is an absolute, or was an absolute towering figure in terms of the number of fields he worked in. And I'm sure that his theological thought would have been developed so much further if we had had him for longer. But we have what we have, and this is what we have. I remember that I used to discuss this book with Tom quite, we used to get into some quite passionate exchanges, particularly about the role of biblical studies and biblical scholarship in the science and religion field. And we certainly didn't see eye to eye. And I remember in particular, the way that I was always intrigued by, I didn't understand what Tom was trying to say overall in this book. I think I've got it now, actually. For instance, I used to ask him, why is there no Christology in your theology of science? Why is there no clear eco-theology? And I think that his point was to place those of us who are in this situation of, we are the apostles of science and religion, if you like. We are the ministers of reconciliation, so we should be working this out in our own contexts in a way. So I think that what Tom was effectively doing was putting us, like Job, in that situation of questioning without telling us, or rather giving it to us on a plate. So I think those are some rather scattered thoughts about Tom's legacy, at least as a scientist theologian, and I will stop there.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful again, and a great overview of that book, which was so central to what Tom has left us. Let's move a bit further south to the north of England, and Joanna Leidenhaag, lecturer in theology and liberal arts at the University of Leeds. Joanna.
Thank you very much, Fraser, and thanks to Wilson and to Mark for what they've already said. I'm going to deliberately focus on a little bit of a narrower aspect of Tom's work. I mean, it still stretches a little bit, but I thought it would be most helpful to focus on the place in which my interactions with him were most commonly positioned and often most fiery. So I met Tom at numerous science and religion conferences, like many of us, and as I said in the obituary that I had the honor of writing for him for ISSR, such encounters usually ended up focusing on the issue of consciousness and emergence theory. So it's clear from the range of topics discussed in this meeting today that Tom could have talked to me about any number of things that he found fascinating, but he was always interested in my doctoral work and my research, which at the time was about the place of consciousness and theories of consciousness within the wider field of science and religion. Since I've only got 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so, I thought I'd give some references right here at the start for anyone who might be interested in doing further reading on what Tom had to say about this topic. Otherwise, I'll forget it at the end. So Tom worked for many years at the University of Durham on the Durham Emergence Project, and two notable articles that came out of this written by him, was Strong Emergence and Downward Causation in Biological Physics, which was published in Philosophica in 2017, and an article that Wilson has already mentioned, Emergence and Topological Order in Classical and Quantum Systems, co-authored with Mark Pexton and Tom Lancaster. If you want a snapshot of my ongoing debates with Tom, then actually published on the day that he died is an edited volume called Conjunctive Explanations, which not only has chapters by both of us, but also short responses. And I'll be drawing on some of that crystallized and preserved debate that we had over many years in this little summary today. So I vividly remember Tom's highly animated surprise. I'm sure you can all picture this. His eyebrows shot up to the ceiling and his jaw almost hit the floor when I told him that as a Christian theologian, I rejected the use of strong emergence theory in favor of panpsychism for discussions of consciousness. I think he was used to arguing for emergence against reductive physicalists. So a Christian panpsychist who was also not a process theologian was an unexpected critic. And at first, I think he didn't quite know what to do with it. Tom knew that most debates on emergence theory versus reductionism are motivated by the desire to explain consciousness. He was very clear that he understood that this was what was at stake for most people. But he thought it was foolish to attempt to tackle such a complicated phenomenon as the human mind, when there are simpler examples of strong emergence that we might gain some purchase on first and more rigorously examine. And there's clear logic in this approach that's applicable to anyone to focus on what we do understand before jumping into the biggest mysteries of our world. But in particular, it was an advantage for Tom because it enabled him to draw on one of his greatest skills, I think, which was explaining to those of us like myself who haven't studied physics or chemistry since they left secondary school about why particular concrete phenomena in the physical world might have vast and sometimes even existential importance for us and our own interests. So Tom's favored so-called simpler examples for talking about emergence were the fractional quantum Hall state effect, where a collection of electrons are confined to a 2D plane in the presence of a magnetic field, and Tom's own pioneering work in polymers, which Wilson has already explained for us very well, in the entangled polymer ring fluids in particular. So I'm going to do my best to summarize Tom's arguments here, but please note, these are not my areas of expertise, they were Tom's. In both these examples, Tom argues that causal structures are manifest strongly emergent causation. That's causation that cannot be explained by appeal only to reductive forces at the micro level. If we're going to have a complete causal explanation of these two phenomena, Tom argued, in purely physical systems in ways that we can really clearly examine, then one needs to posit top-down causation. In the fractional quantum Hall state and effect, Tom argues that electrons do not merely become quantum entangled in correlating pairs, the way we're used to talking about quantum entanglement, but that in this particular example, electrons become long-range entangled, such that a special pattern of entanglement across the whole system applies, such that it's the system as a whole that's topologically ordered, so it behaves like a unified whole. So importantly, this process is irreversible. So the electrons in a fractal quantum Hall state are not subject to local decoherence or renormalization, is the phrase, without destroying the system as a whole. The impact of topology is seen even more clearly in his own work on polymers. So Tom explains how the changing of the topology of polymer molecules, So the difference as to whether this string of monomers is shaped in a hoop or a star or some other shape, changes the core physical properties at the macro level. And Wilson's video of the Play-Doh-y stuff that can stretch in slow time, but behaves like a solid with a ball in fast time is an excellent example of this. In the special case of polymer rings, Tom argued that this essential additional information over and above the microstructure determines the future behavior and properties of the polymer. In particular, the polymer ring remains microscopically to behave like a fluid, but macroscopically to behave like an elastic solid. In Tom's own words, and I quote him, "This entirely classical system possesses a kind of topological order that makes the system behave as a unified whole. It's a solid when linked, and it's a fluid when not." But what do these two examples, of which Tom would love to talk very passionately and enthusiastically, have to do with consciousness? He uses these two examples to show us that bottom-up determinism, as argued for by reductive physicalist philosophers like Yang-Won Kim, cannot be a universal rule. He only needed one example to disprove that, but he gave us two. And he could point in great detail, without any recourse to kind of weird quantum mechanics stuff, that reductionism fails to provide a complete causal explanation of the world. So in at least these two cases, and he suggested there were likely hundreds of others, we need both bottom-up and top-down causes to explain things. But again, what does that have to do with consciousness? It's answering this question that was at the heart of my disagreement with Tom. Tom's hope was that this detailed work would provide clues, a way forward, or inspiration for future empirical and predictive work in the science of consciousness and the brain. But I think it's far from obvious that these kinds of examples of non-reductive causes in physical systems will ever get us any closer to first-person perspective or subjective experience. I don't think we can infer the strongly emergent nature of the mind from the strongly emergent nature of polymer melts. Strong emergence-based explanations do not scale up and down. In fact, I think that's part of the point of irreducibility. Instead, irreducible causal factors have to be considered on a case-by-case basis. And I think Tom would agree with me on that point anyway. But if no amount of strong emergence in the physical world will, for me, ever provide sufficient evidence for strong emergence of consciousness from supposedly dead matter, some emergence theorists admit that corporeal matter might not be wholly dead, as I'm referring to it, wholly non-experiencing, but must include already the necessary mental ingredients for consciousness to emerge in organic structures. In other words, they abandon strict emergence and instead adopt a form of emergent panpsychism. And this is what I, over the course of our many discussions, urged Tom to do. Before Tom died, I think it's fair to say that both of us had softened in our incredulity of the other's position, and we came closer to exposing where the real points of disagreement lie. And isn't that the joy of prolonged intellectual disagreement? Tom convinced me that strong emergence with downward causation within the physical world may be something I have to accept as an empirical fact. If anything, I now realize that this may in fact aid the panpsychist in integrating their explanation of how subjects combine, or put more simply, why brains but not rocks are conscious, with contemporary science. Tom also pushed me to expand my definition of what constituted an empirical question, as opposed to a purely philosophical one, and so encouraged me to place more hope in the power of science as a gift and a vocation from God than I think I did before we met. In return, I think I may have convinced Tom that panpsychism is not utterly ridiculous, which is certainly what he first assumed, and maybe I even persuaded him that it could, in theory at least, have some theological benefits. However, I would have needed many more years of conversation, I think, if I was ever going to get Tom to be a panpsychist. In truth, I'm not sure I ever would have got there. But I take comfort from the final line of his response to me in the edited volume I mentioned earlier, where he wrote, "I find myself in agreement with the author in all but the label that she advances." So thank you to Tom for his prolonged care and disagreement with me.
And thank you very much, Joanna, for that fascinating account of your engagements with Tom. And I look forward to reading the published version of that in the book you mentioned. And we come further south to Professor Christopher Southgate, Professor of Theodicy at the University. Excuse me, I hoped I might get through the introduction before I sneezed, but I didn't. Professor of Theodicy at the University of Exeter, and going to talk about another aspect of Tom's many-sided achievements. Chris.
Thank you very much, Fraser. It's a great pleasure to be part of this conversation. When I think of Tom McLeish, one thing that immediately comes to me is his sense of delight at new discovery. I was very glad that Wilson mentioned Proverbs 8:30, "I was daily beside him as a little child," because Tom in his passionate enthusiasm would talk about a new finding about the processes of the natural world, almost like a small boy describing unwrapping a Christmas present. And I sense that he was just as delighted whether the finding came from his own group or someone else's. That sense of excitement at something revealed, brought to light, makes it unsurprising that Tom was so fond of the descriptions of mining in Job 28, quoting, "The men set their hands against the flinty rock and overturn mountains at their roots. They split open channels in the rocks, and their eye lights on any precious object. They explore the sources of rivers, bringing to light what has been hidden." Tom points out in Faith and Wisdom in Science that out of all God's creatures, only humans make possible this form of seeing. And Tom presses on to propose that this exploration is an analogy to God's own contemplation of the world, and to claim that, quote, "Wisdom is to be found in participating in a deep understanding of the world, its structure and dynamics." Well, so far we might be tempted to think of him as a physicist with an extraordinary taste for burrowing into difficult biblical books and the energy to pursue over the course of 20 years. His sense that the church does need a theology of science, as well as just an interdisciplinary conversation. But from my own standpoint as a poet, I found his subsequent project yet more fascinating. He told how talking with a working artist colleague led him to see just what parallels there are between the creative process in the arts and the sciences. He wrote then that he, the artist colleague, spoke of his first experimental attempts to realize an original conception, of the confrontation of his original ideas with the real constraints of material, of paint and photographic print, of the necessary reformulation of the original concept, of the repeat of those frustrated assays not once but many times. I found that I could tell the story of almost any program of scientific research I had experienced in the same terms. If I had been surprised by the element of experiment and trial in his artistic project, he had not expected so much of my story of science to speak of the role of imagination. Not only that, it became clear to us that not only did the intellectual and technical histories of our projects map closely onto one another, but so also our emotional trajectories of excitement, hope, disappointment, rekindling of hope, and resolution found common language. And this realization led eventually to another monograph, Tom's 2019, The Poetry and Music of Science, full of insights of all kinds. In effect, Tom sets out to reassure Keats that science-informed philosophy need not be the icy touch that clips the wings of angels, providing it is seen as part of the broad exercise of the human imagination, rather than siloed off in its own language game. Actually, I think the parallels between poetry and science, as enterprises both committed to looking beyond surfaces at what's really there, may run even deeper than Tom suggests. Because my experience of trying to draft a new poem is that the process is one of discovery. It has parallels with the mining that Tom celebrates in his treatment of Job 28. It's possible to be deceived, as with mining. Material that shines on the surface may be fool's gold. Sometimes a poet needs his or her community to help assay whether the metal is genuine. And as with mining, it is possible to wreck the vein by following the wrong path, or cutting it off short in search of an easy win. Or in processing the ore, one can overheat it or add too much editorial acid, after which the poem may or may not be recoverable from its crucible. This is the sort of conversation I shall so much miss having with Tom McLeish. I last saw Tom at the reception after my 2022 Boyle lecture. Because of lockdown, there had not been the opportunity for him to receive his Boyle medal after his own bravura lecture of 2021, complete with pink rubber and pink putty, and its call to subvert the early modern separations between science and wider imaginative explorations, and to learn once again to read the world as poetry. So we received our medals together, a good memory to hold on to. I'm going to end this tribute to Tom with a short poem, a prize-winning sonnet I wrote some years ago. I've chosen it because Tom expressed particular appreciation of it. And it seems to me that it attempts in its own way that fusion of inspirations, scientific, artistic, contemplative, that Tom McLeish so embodied. It also has an elegiac tone, appropriate to the sheer extent of the loss felt by so many, personally and professionally, at his untimely death. The poem reflects on the landscapes of the Scottish Highlands, and especially the Black Coolin Hills of Skye, linking them with the music of late Beethoven. West Highlands Sonnet. There is a sort of sadness always to these glaciated landscapes. The hills lie scoured. Recent ice slow dragged across corries and coals, dumping debris thus devoured on drab moraines, leaves a scarred sense, weaves a slow traumatized song, much attacked by dissonance, dense like late Beethoven, bleak, deaf sung. The Black Coolins are the grosser fuga of the set, strange, spiky, insistent to the edge of sanity as to what must be. Structure at its limit shatters, leaving movement the only unity. The theme, jagged, leaping, which redeems a scoured sadness driven to extremes. Rest in peace, Tom. May you rise in glory.
Thank you very much again, Christopher. Very moving. Thank you. We have plenty of time for discussion now. We may not need them all the time we have until past, but there is time now. I'm very moved myself by the talks we've heard this evening. I've always had huge admiration for Tom's work. And what I'm left with are regrets about the conversations I didn't have with Tom. And I never really had the opportunity for deep engagement with him, as I did with some other people like John Polkinghorne, and I really regret that. And there are two conversations in particular I would like to have had with Tom. One, and I just sort of touched on this in the response to his Boyle lecture, is that I think the maverick Cambridge-based science and religion group, the Epiphany philosophers, were sketching out some time before Tom the kind of theology of science that he wanted to see in the work of people like Margaret Masterman and Dorothy Emmett. A theology of science which recognized the importance of contemplation in science and its centrality to it. I'd like to have had that conversation with Tom. And another hero of mine is Owen Barfield, one of the Oxford Inklings, friend of Lewis and Tolkien, who had a very, very rich theology of imagination that I think Tom would have found fascinating. I think there are aspects of Barfield that he would have reacted against, and I think we might have had quite a fiery conversation about Barfield, as Joanna had about other things, but it's a conversation that I regret not having had and now never will have. Just a few thoughts of my own. I wonder if any of the speakers would like to respond to what they've heard from the other speakers. We have time for that if there's anything you'd like to say.
I want to ask Mark a question.
Please do. Yeah.
I found what you said about scientists, theologians, and then wisdom very helpful, Mark. I'm just wondering if you could, I guess, crystallize for me how Tom's work might have changed your own identity as a scientist, theologian, or not, or whatever label you would prefer. But does that make sense?
Thanks, Joanna. Yeah, great question. I have often been labeled as a scientist theologian, but I've never really liked the title myself. I don't expect Tom would have particularly appreciated it either, because he chose the natural philosopher title for himself. And incidentally, I would love to hear Wilson's take on this next, because he came first, so hasn't had a chance to sort of talk about the scientist theologian himself. I think Wilson is a very prominent scientist theologian as well, or natural philosopher. I've always found Tom's work, his theology, to be really difficult to get a handle on. And that may be because he wasn't a systematizer. Maybe he was a bottom-up thinker. I'm not sure. Again, I suspect he would resist that as well. But in any case, we all remember how conversations with Tom would be very, very quick, scattergun, ideas flying everywhere and very, very exciting. I think his writing, his theological writing, is like that too. So it's quite difficult to find clear overarching strategies, arguments. But I think, having read the Faith and Wisdom in Science book a few times now, and I personally do think that is, at least for me anyway, his kind of magnum opus, the one that I get the most out of. This issue about exploration of wisdom is really important. And I think, so, teaching the science and religion world, critical realism is always so central because it gets mentioned so much, particularly by the first generation. I suppose one thing I've taken from Tom is that if we're going to go beyond that, then wisdom is a pretty good category to replace it with, and to think about the way that science works and that we work as scientists and scientist theologians. But I'm not sure that I could say much more that it is overarching and strategizing, because I don't think Tom's thought works like that. But I'd love to hear what Wilson thinks.
Maybe I can contribute to you a little bit of insight to where both of us started in Cambridge when we were studying. certainly in the more evangelical tradition that we both belong to, the Cambridge Intercollegiate Christian Union, there's a very clear hierarchy of Christian vocation. On the top of it is being a missionary. If you really must, you can be a church minister. And if you're failing all of those, you should do a people-centered vocation, like being a doctor. But why would you spend all day in front of a blank piece of paper doing calculations, or in my case, in a dark room fiddling with a laser? I mean, that's the lowest of the low, only just a little bit above being a thief. Both of us has a very strong sense that, although we wouldn't have quite dared to put it in those terms in those days, that God has called us to be physicists. But we have no idea what that may mean. So in other words, there's no spirituality to help the scientist bum on the pew. You know, if you join a church, they don't want to know about your physics. They want to know, can you lead a Bible study group? Are you going to be a missionary? And it's just no good. So both of us felt very lonely. So we found each other. And our journey started with trying to articulate what might it mean to be called to be a physicist as a Christian believer. And I think you will fail to understand Tom at the bottom of it if you didn't know that that's where he started. In the end, it's a struggle in the best sense of the word, to articulate what it might mean to be a physicist, called to be a Christian, called to be a physicist. And I think that explains why, for example, I mean, the best way I can explain to you the genre of what I think faith, wisdom, and science is a rhapsody. To use a musical term, it's not a sort of Beethoven symphony. It's a rhapsody, is the way I look at it. And in terms of system, I mean, I can tell you what my latest conversation with him in the last 2 years have been, and I know what he's been thinking almost literally on his deathbed, where I pushed him most. I mean, I can't remember who said this, but, you know, given how much he wanted to say about Job is, to me, disappointingly low amount actually on Job in that book. And the other time I felt it was Marilyn McCord Adams, Christ and Horrors. There's a chapter called Starting with Job, and there's not a single reference to the book of Job in the chapter. So she did slightly worse than Tom, but actually infinitely worse, because she had none. I mean, I did a PDF search. There's absolutely nothing about Job in that chapter. What she meant was starting with suffering. She didn't mean starting with Job. But anyway, what I was pushing him on is, look, you are a committed Christian believer. Our conversation started with what it might mean for, you know, the Lord and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ to call us to be a physicist. What is that is specifically Christian about your theology of science? I'm not saying that other faiths are not valid representation or whatever, but given that you are a specifically Christian believer, is there anything that is specifically Christian about your God, the God that you talk about, or your, you know, what is it about your theology of science that in some sense is cruciform? Because, you know, that is what is distinctive about the Christian message. And he agreed with me that that may be the one big hole in that book. And I think he managed to think himself, and it's a pity that I don't know what he thought about this in detail, or whether he has managed to write anything down. But he was meditating on the last word of Christ in John's gospel on his deathbed. So when Jesus said tetelestai, what is the it? What is finished? So, you know, the traditional view might be the redemption of mankind is finished. The work of salvation may be finished. And I think his final answer would be, in fact, the work of creation is finished. That there's something started in Genesis 1 that is actually not finished until then. And the conversation that we had was partly about Robert Grotesque, because you may remember Robert Grotesque was one of the minority who believed that the incarnation would have happened without sin. And so there's something about the death of Christ that transcends even the salvation of the world, given it has fallen into sin. So I think that's the direction his thoughts were moving. I hope he has time to write some of it down, and that eventually some of it may be published. But he was meditating on tetelestai. But I don't know whether that helps, Mark. But I think, you know, scientist theologian, is that how he would have thought about it? I think he was a Christian scientist looking for a vocation. I think from there everything flowed.
Thanks, Wilson. That's really helpful. I'm also interested to hear you reflect on the point that there's so much of Tom's thought that we don't have written down.
Yes.
I mean, we're all, in effect, we're all waiting for the next book, which never came. But do you think there may be some other writings that might be collected together?
But he was certainly writing. I mean, we wrote something for your volume, so he was certainly writing towards the end. Yeah. So I have no reason to believe that that's the only thing he wrote. That quantum theology essay that he wrote with me. So he was writing, and I know, I mean, because he told me he was thinking about tetelestai, and he says his conclusion was that what was finished, and we're linking it to Romans 8 and all the rest of it, is the it is finished. The it is creation, the work of creation. So I hope he had time to write some of this down. I mean, I could ask Julian this Thursday when I see her, but that may be the wrong question to ask in a memorial service. Did Tom write anything? But you know,
yes, it may be too soon, but yes,
I think that's too soon.
Yeah, it'd be great if someone could rummage through his hard disk. I mean, certainly that. I mean, I didn't mention it when I was talking because it was just yet another of Tom's many strings to his bows. But yes, the quantum theology paper that you wrote with him just really in the last few months of his life was a great piece of work. And again, it pointed forward to a lot of interesting things that could be done. Hopefully, people will take up on the prompts that you and he made. You could, Wilson, in fact, I hope.
Someday, yeah, someday.
Of course, I mean, that's a fascinating reflection on tetelestai, which I want to think a whole lot more about. But for some people, the lack of a specific Christological dimension in his published theology of science is perhaps an advantage, because it means that rich theme of wisdom is accessible beyond Christian thought to many other patterns. So that seems to me to be potentially really important.
I mean, I think like almost everything else that is worth thinking about, a strength is always simultaneously a weakness. I mean, there's no two ways about it. I mean, I completely agree with what you said. Nevertheless, I mean, there is. I mean, going back to McCord Adams in her Christ and Horrors, you know, she has this interesting phrase called the lowest common denominator God. And there are some discussions of science and religion, especially that go to the LCD God, that eventually becomes not particularly satisfactory. I mean, this is, you know, insofar as I've had arguments with Tom, that's what we argue about. That whether talking about science and religion in terms of an LCD God, in the end, has some weaknesses.
Yes, and and in a way, it seems to me that divine speech in Job kind of runs counter to that tendency, because it wants to insist on a very particular character to the creator God, it seems to me.
Right, and that speech, of course, in the context of Job, the Christian would like to say that it comes to a focal point on Good Friday and Easter Sunday, right? And so I think if Thomas had another 20 years, undoubtedly he would have gone down that direction, because he's laid down a path for himself already. And that was what I was hoping that in our dotage, in our retirement here, and I may actually work on together. I had hoped that, because he was interested in it, but you know, it's not to be.
In terms of forthcoming books, there's an interesting note in the chat from John Topham. And John, for the record, can you just say for us what you said in the chat?
Certainly, yes. As I understand it, the project that Tom had at York with Amanda Rees and Franziska Kult is due to result in a book about conflict around science and religion. It's called, I think, War of the Worlds: Science, Religion and the Human Future, and that's contracted with OUP. I think what I heard was that David Livingston at Durham was going to be involved in pulling it all together in Tom's absence, but don't take that as gospel.
Do you mean Wilkinson?
David Wilkinson is what I mean, yes. Confusing my Davids.
Thank you for sharing that. Any questions from those who are here but haven't spoken? If you do have questions, you're very welcome. Or comments.
Can I make one more comment?
Please.
The other thing that, I mean, if anyone eventually want to write a PhD thesis on Tom and to get to the bottom of it, the other aspect of Tom that no one has mentioned so far, but I think is essential, is Tom as the preacher, after he was a lay reader. And I think, I mean, if musically, I would put his book as a rhapsody. Theologically, in terms of genre, I would put it as kerygma. I would put it as proclamation. And proclamation, by its nature, is untidy. Jesus was not a tidy theologian. Paul was not a tidy theologian. They were quick-fire preachers. So I think the way to understand that book is, again, you should treat each chapter as a sermon. I think all kinds of interesting things come out when you think about it. If you begin to hear it as being proclaimed from the pulpit, you hear it differently.
Interesting.
Try reading it out as a sermon, aloud.
I think I'd also like to pay tribute to Tom's work in encouraging that initiative, equipping Christian leaders in an age of science, and his insistence on the importance of ministers acquiring a scientific literacy. I mean, I think the churches have been very slow in this area, but I think that initiative has given a very helpful spur to that work, and in important ways that which will roll themselves out perhaps over a generation, but it's a very important start, I think.
Definitely. I mean, there are so many different things that could be said about Tom, aren't there? His many, many achievements. I just wanted to make one personal comment, which was one thing I really, really valued about him, was that when he was in a room, he was often the center of the attention, not because of his greatness or sense of authority, or because he was telling it like it is to everyone, but because he was very warm and always so enthusiastic. And I noticed how many of us in the course of talking have said how easy it was to have arguments with Tom and to dispute things. And I really appreciated listening to Joanna's dispute about panpsychism. It just seems natural that when referring to Tom, we might talk about the things we would disagree with him about as well as agree, because he was that kind of sparky, incredibly, the kind of person who would just give you thoughts and just make things pop into your head, new ideas. So it was part of the energy that he just instantly infused into a room, I think, when he was there. And that's one thing I just want to mention that I really valued about having Tom in a meeting. It would always liven it up massively.
But we really did have the competition of leaving books next to each other's bedside to see which one can keep the other person awake. And Steiner really did keep him awake all night. He woke up in the morning. I said, "Did you have a good sleep?" He said, "No, but it was a jolly good book." So, yes, and that's the sort of person he is.
We're towards the end of our time. It's been a great session, and I'm very grateful to everyone who's contributed and spoken. And thank you all so much. Tom was a great person, made a huge contribution to the field of whatever we want to call it, science and religion or whatever. That's not a debate to have at this moment, but a huge contribution to the interest of all of us. And he will live on in our minds and thoughts and memories and hearts. Thank you all for being part of this session.